Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming. Sorry for our standard technical difficulties. But we appreciate you all making it out today. I'm Vanilla Saunders. I'm the editor chief of American Scientists. These talks are run in collaboration with Sigma Xi's RTP chapter, Science Communicators of North Carolina, and the NC Biotechnology Center, which is kind enough to provide our pizza funding. So we thank them for feeding us. Please feel free to come up if you need seats. There's more seats up here. We promise not to, talk to you or anything.
I don't know, we've all done that.
Well, you're allowed to talk, but just push the chair and you sit. I'll be a nice neighbor. So we have another couple talks in this series. We go through May, then we take a break for the summer. We come back in September. So please keep an eye out for future events which are sent now through Science Communicators of North Carolina. So hopefully you've been getting those events. We had to switch systems, so apologies for any technical difficulties there. Also keep an eye out for an upcoming event. May 14th, we have our annual Career Options Outside Academia event for postdocs and graduate students at the Biotech Center. So in the past, some of you have been involved in that and have come as speakers to talk to graduate students. So if you're willing to sign up again, let us know. But today, we are very lucky to have Georgina Sanchez with us. I left my bio over here, I'm sorry. Dr. Sanchez is a research scholar and faculty fellow with the Center for Geospatial Analytics at NC State University. Her interdisciplinary research approach to research bridges land and climate change science, hydrology, and geospatial analytics to address complex sustainability challenges. Her research also involves participatory modeling techniques and principles of knowledge co-production that engage communities, stakeholders, and end users in development of technologies and strategies to tackle natural resource challenges. She holds a Ph.D. in Forestry and Environmental Resources from NCSU, an MS in Biosystems Engineering from Michigan State, and a BS in Agricultural Engineering from the University of Costa Rica. So please thank Dr. Sanchez. Sometimes the thing. It's me too.
It's not now.
Sorry, guys. Okay. All right. Can you fix it? Yeah. So many steps. So many steps. It didn't actually quit. Okay. I know it says it quit, but it didn't.
Well, it's part of the stochasticity of bringing sudden shocks into a presentation. Keeps it interesting.
I'm not getting any screen share. Insurance for
Okay. You know.
I don't know. Is it not working?
Now it's Zoom. My God, showing some screen sharing has failed to start. Please try again later.
But we can see it in the room.
Yes. So this is Zoom's fault right now. Log out and log back in. We're just going to
Hang on a second. Can't hear you. He's in a meeting.
Right side. Everyone's enjoying some good.
You still in the Zoom?
Yes.
So,
I don't have the one.
let me see if I can share the report, the slides from here. And then you can use those. That way we don't have, I don't have to synchronize with you.
Is it letting me share?
Hang on a second, I'm trying to actually get this down.
It's boring. Never seen someone reject screen share. And just straight up say no. I've never seen that. So.
I can. Wait, does it look like it's up on your screen up there?
Yes, it's up here.
Slides.
Perfect.
All right.
All right. Well, I was gonna say thank you for the introduction. I'll say thank you for fixing all the tech behind all this canal and Taylor.
Ridiculous, yeah. It's a workaround. Yeah, it's a workaround.
All right. Hi everyone. Hope you're enjoying your pizza. It's really nice to be here. Thank you for the introduction. It's been elemental. My name is Georgina. My goal for today will be then to share with you how we can use geospatial modeling to simulate future urban scenarios to then aid forward-thinking resilience planning. If we can advance.
You would have to advance yours, I think. Hang on. Yeah.
All right. So research has shown that we humans, we struggle with making decisions that impact the future. This happens because we emotionally disconnect from our future selves, which makes us undervalue those long-term outcomes and consequences. What I find fascinating is that we often ignore the importance of our future selves simply because we lack imagination. Psychologists have found that engaging with future visualizations can profoundly influence the way in which we act today. Can you please advance?
And you're gonna have to do yours at the same time, and I'll just keep up with you on the Zoom. How about that? You just go ahead with that.
So, for example, if we were to be presented or confronted with an image of oneself, age progress, then the idea here is that there's a strong motivation to take action. Why do we act? Well, because that image presents a vision of ourselves. It makes us to really bring and connect us with our future selves. And while I am not a psychologist, I do spend a lot of my time thinking about our collective future. My work focuses on harnessing data to understand patterns, and then developing models and projections that help us envision future transformations, like for different applications, like for example, understanding where and when the urban landscape will continue to expand, or investigating how different communities may adapt in the face of climate stressors. Our lab experience has clearly shown that when we make a problem spatial, it becomes personal. Like with that age progressed image, geovisualization and mapping really help us to engage with the where and when of impact so that we can understand who's been affected and how. And there's a video, so you need to play it.
It's not working for you? Oh, there it is.
Oh, I do. All right, now let me transport you to Charleston, South Carolina. Here we have a bird's eye view from the region. This is a low-lying region experiencing rapid urbanization where natural and cultural ecosystem services are threatened by the coastal squeeze, or this compound pressure from urban expansion and sea level rise. This region, I would argue, stands at the forefront of climate adaptation, given how vulnerable it is to flooding. For the purpose of this conversation, I'm going to focus on a case study we conducted around the Charleston metropolitan region, but please keep in mind that our research also looks at geographical impacts of urbanization and climate distress. So I'll talk a little bit more about that towards the end of my presentation. Current state-of-the-art and risk assessment looks something like this. We typically overlay an inundation layer onto existing development so that we can pinpoint locations that might be at risk. Yet, this approach only provides us with a partial picture. Neighborhoods are not born equal, and our models should account for disparities and for different levels of adaptive capacity to estimate exposure and to assess risk. We need to understand where people struggle and how. We need comprehensive understanding of future scenarios, how communities may respond to flood damage, who can afford adaptation, and the challenges faced by those with very limited resources for protection. So the question is, how would our actions change today if we could see these future outcomes? On the positive side, then, our research group has really taken this challenge and recently developed important modeling advances that allows us to simulate these interactions between urban growth, increased flooding, and a human adaptive response. And we do this by integrating these novelties with the Futures Land Change Modeling Framework. I see some of you already scanned it. Here you have a QR code where you can learn more about the Futures model. I'll keep it for a couple of slides. And the Futures Land Change Model is a spatially interactive framework, which means that processes that happen in one location affect nearby areas. It was intentionally designed to address the environmental impacts of urbanization. It is also open source, which means that anyone can access the code, anyone can continue contributing towards its development, and is powered by GIS, meaning that you can compute simulations yourself if you have some background in GIS, and you can do that through GIS. By being open source, we also allow for others to support its development. So in the case of our lab group, multiple researchers have contributed to the development of this land change model for over a decade now. Under the hood, we have 4 submodels: development potential, a patch growing algorithm, and land demand. And then we also have this climate forcing submodel, which is the latest novelty. I'll explain more about it. What do I mean by these submodels? So first, development potential. What we have here is really a way for us to capture site suitability. Where is new development more likely to happen in the future? So we do this by basically assessing historical patterns and then integrating different geospatial predictors. The second thing that we really care about is then within the patch growing algorithm is this capacity to mimic the urban fabric, representing the size and shapes of newly development patterns, so we can accurately capture the spatial structure of development. Then with land demand, what we're doing is representing per capita land consumption, effectively people or the distribution of people per unit of developed area. And last, with our climate forcing submodel, what we're doing is assessing the local capacity for adaptive response. Meaning, what is the likelihood of any given location for residents to have or find the necessary resources to adapt to flood threats? Again, because this is the most novel implementation, most recent implementation, I'll take a deeper dive here. What we did for this submodel is implement a flood response function. This function relates adaptive capacity and the level of flood damage sustained. You can see that I have adaptive capacity on the x-axis and damage y-axis. This is one specific flood response function. This function can take a number of shapes. I'll explain what the colors mean in one moment. The idea here then is to use user-specified parameters to represent different scenarios and then explore differences between the scenarios, evaluate the trade-offs. For example, we can introduce local realities, community preferences to represent one or other scenarios, or test not yet enacted policies. To then again, evaluate the outcomes and compare trade-offs. For this one flood response function that I'm displaying here, this represents a plausible business as usual scenario. The assumption here is that residents will adapt to threats as needed. So this is why we tend to refer to this scenario as a reactive response scenario. We're not implementing any policies to minimize exposure or damage. As you can see, we have three response state spaces, and these are the outcomes that we can simulate in addition to growing cities. So we have protect, retreat, and trapped. What do I mean by protect? Well, with higher levels of adaptive capacity, residents are more likely to seek protective measures. This is the assumption here. You can see that I have one example in that image. That is an area with greater adaptive capacity, so towards the right side of the graph, where they're using gray infrastructure. This could be also elevating structures. Another way to protect is to integrate nature-based solutions. With retreat, if the level of damage sustained is high enough, retreat as a means to adapt becomes then the more likely response. This would be the second assumption here. And you can see, again, the image represents a typical condition where we would assume the residents are likely to retreat. But these, again, may vary depending on the adaptive capacity. And then we have trapped. With low to moderate damage and low to moderate adaptive capacity, this third type of response is triggered. And I think this image perfectly captures the essence of what we mean by trapped. So here we have a resident with floodwaters up to their knees, holding a sign that says, "Please slow down. Your waves are flooding our homes." These are the most vulnerable communities. Because of the high cost of migration and adaptation, these communities are likely to retreat only if or when a flood event threatens their lives. Here we have now some results from the futures land change model. We're going to look at the first component, the probability of new development. I'll walk you through everything that you're looking at this in this visualization. What we see here again is a representation of that business as usual scenario. You see results at decadal time steps and all the way through 2100. For Charleston expanding economy and population, what we can anticipate for this region is continuous growth across time and across the region, through time and across the region. And this would lead to the conversion of natural and working lands into developed areas. This modeling approach, the futures modeling approach, is probabilistic, which then on the map areas that are in darker colors of orange represent locations that are more likely to experience this conversion from non-urban to urban or from non-developed to developed. And lighter tones of orange then represent exactly the opposite. We can visualize where, when, and how new development may impact areas that we care about. Again, making it personal. Now, as residents and planners become increasingly aware of the growing risks of flooding, they're likely to adapt to this threat and whenever feasible. And again, here's the representation of that protective measures as response state. So here what we see is our locations represented in darker tones of turquoise that are more likely to have or find the necessary resources to build protective measures, elevating homes, building levees, building nature-based solutions. And you can see a very distinct pattern here. For instance, right around the Charleston Peninsula, that donut-shaped pattern, this is where we have most of the, this is the business district, this is where we have most of the economy depending on the entire region, truly depends on the economy that happens in this location. So of course, we anticipate this area to then build protective measures. With the other response state, now for retreat, we see a completely different story here. So in the absence of specific policies to minimize exposure or potential damage, vulnerable populations are likely to retreat the area. This pattern is now represented in darker tones of purple. These are the concentrations of vulnerabilities that may, these are communities that potentially may also become climate migrants. And our last response state, now we have trapped communities. Communities trapped in this cycle of recurrent flooding damage, they exhibit a pattern that is quite similar to those for the retreating response outcome. What we can see that there is a little bit more is kind of like the hotspots, and I'm going back and forth here so that you can see it a little bit better. Areas that present a higher likelihood of retreat are nearby areas that present a higher likelihood of track outcomes. This is because this northern portion of the peninsula, this cluster of vulnerability, it's represented, it's characterized by high vulnerability levels for this very specific region. Knowing where impact happens and how communities might respond helps create locally appropriate solutions. Here we see that we have a much greater understanding of what's happening in the region now. It's not just, are we inside or outside of an inundation or a flood-prone area? Here we have a rich understanding of the geography of impacts in response so that we can better target locally appropriate solutions. For example, if we know that a residential project is to be built inside of a floodplain, in a couple of years, residents may face the decision to retreat. Why not protecting that land now? So far, I've shared with you one plausible scenario, but the true power of this approach is really to explore a number of what-if scenarios or not yet enacted policies or interventions to compare outcomes and evaluate trade-offs, rather than trying to identify the perfect pathway forward. Here we have a couple of additional scenarios that we computed for that Charleston Metropolitan case study. I'm not going to go into details of how we parameterize each one of these scenarios. I think some of them are a little bit more intuitive than others. You see the first one, the reactive response scenario. That's the one that I've been sharing with you. We have a polarized population. Resist, I think, is another one that is quite intuitive based on the name. The assumption here is that there are resources to withstand your position, even if you're in a flood-prone area. Managed retreat is another one that is quite discussed in this space, and trapped populations. So let me walk you through what you're looking here. First of all, we have percent change in developed exposed land area that is exposed to flooding. Projections by 2050. You cannot see my cursor, that's fine. On the y-axis, we have winter. Does that work? There you go. Yes. On the y-axis, we have percent change relative to the baseline. The baseline is today's condition. So if we were to compare 2050 with 2024, what is the relative difference of exposed development? On the x-axis, now we have, I'm summarizing results by different return periods. If you are familiar with this, for example, 1% annual exceedance probability is your 100-year flood load. Now, values that are above zero, those represent greater exposure compared to today's conditions. Values that are below zero, the opposite, lower exposure relative to today's conditions. So here what we found is, and I think this is pretty intuitive, managed retreat is the only intervention with predicted exposure below current conditions. And again, this is pretty intuitive. If we were to remove people from flood-prone areas, of course, we're going to reduce exposure. But again, the really interesting aspect of this is for us to be able to evaluate that and understand, for instance, what could be the relocation of those retreating communities, how that's going to impact other areas for positive economic growth, or for also a little bit more complex interactions with the natural environment. Being able to assess those trade-offs is the true power of this approach. So, of course, again, this brings us back to the question, are destination communities prepared to receive climate migrants? As part of the modeling framework that I share with you, we also keep track of where retreating residents may relocate. Every time you file your taxes, you report your zip code. If you were to move, then the IRS keeps track of every single time each one of us move from one zip code to another one. We use that to create a migration flow that allows us then to basically characterize the probability of any one person moving from any one county into any other within the nation. That's what we're implementing here. For the Charleston case study, what we found is that the great majority of retreating residents are likely to stay within that 3-county area, within the vicinity of the Charleston metro area. Then the second tier of migration would stay within the state, within South Carolina. But we also found that residents may relocate as far west as Washington State, Oregon, and California. Some of you may be, for instance, looking at Florida. So we're talking about communities that are potentially retreating from a location because of the damage associated with flooding. And those relocating in Florida, it might be a little bit counterintuitive. So that's one of the limitations of this approach. So far, we have used historical migration flows. One could, for example, introduce a climate-aware population migration trend. Oh, that was a terrible name from my part, I guess. But one we can consider a climate-aware scenario where we understand how people now consider within their decision-making process of where to relocate, is this a safe place from a climate perspective? Am I going to California and then I'm going to have to deal with fires, drought, or should I relocate in Florida and then again consider the threat of flooding, of course, as part of something that I need to live with? So these are the type of questions that we can start answering by understanding the dynamics, not just the local dynamics and the direct impact, but also the regional dynamics, indirect impact. So this really highlights that sea level rise is not a coastal issue. It's an everyone's issue. I mentioned this early on that we are also evaluating these processes and simulations at scale to truly understand the geography of impact and response at a larger scale. Our research also looked into the whole south and southeast of the United States, answering questions like where new development hotspots may emerge as people seek safer areas in potentially higher elevations, higher latitudes. We can also start diving into an exploration of not just people migration, but habitat migration. We know that with climate change, for instance, marsh migration will be a big change in our landscapes. So understanding where the two may overlap is really important. All of this work is an effort of a team, a wonderful team that brings together Ph.D. students, science communicators, geospatial software engineers, faculty, researchers, senior scientists, and everyone work together to create advances, not just in the land change modeling community, but also the way in which we communicate this information. We are also, it's possible for us to make this work thanks to the funding partners, you can see here. And that's everything I have for you. If you have questions for me, I'll take them. Okay, thank you.
We'll start with in-room questions, and if we get any online questions, I'll intersperse them in between, so. Perfect. Start here, and you'll be next.
You got any interest from insurance companies? Because this certainly is something they'd be interested.
Yes, I have. Not from a let's collaborate and let me use your data. We're not there yet, and I don't know if that's the direction that we're taking. But yes, I would anticipate that should be eventually one more player, one more stakeholder that we need to bring into conversation. I have been approached in terms of, hey, can we share your publications within our website? Hey, can we become somehow cross communication partners, if that is even a thing? but I would be quite open to the conversation. I think we should be having those maybe even uncomfortable conversations to really understand insurance is one of the major reasons why we are where we are. Great question.
I apologize in advance for this, but if you used climate aware migration patterns, you could call it CAMP, and that would be really satisfying.
Okay.
Well, now you have an acronym.
Now we have an acronym. It's good, and I won't forget about it because it's recorded.
Do we have other questions? Go ahead, in the back.
Yeah, so I'm thinking, tying into the planning aspect, how you think this tool might be helpful in determining where people should not develop, or if there's been storm damage or flooding damage not to redevelop. Do you see that as a potential for this tool?
Yes, and we have been working with some planning departments to understand where, for example, we have planned development zoning and of course, inside of a floodplain or an area that our model shows that it's of high vulnerability, and then it could become a hotspot for retreat. So yeah, that's a space that we're also investigating, partnering with different planning departments. It takes time and effort to engage with different stakeholders. So part of what we're doing is making these resources available via online so that you can interact with them, explore them. Even if you're a resident yourself, you may not need to be the head of a planning department, so that you can understand and start like evaluating different scenarios, identify where is my house, where is my school, where's my church, where do I recreate, and how different stressors, well, specifically flooding, might then impact those locations that I care about.
We have one more here then. Did you have a question? I thought you'd had a question.
Oh, I was gonna ask about, so this system could be used to look at places in North Carolina at the same level that you look at Charleston?
Yes, we are doing that, yes.
And the other question I have is this flooding focus, is there anything with heat that could be done through the same?
Great question. That's a great question. Of course, we can introduce a number of climate stressors: heat, fire, drought. We haven't implemented those advances. At this point, we started with flooding, but the idea is that moving forward, our research will expand to then introduce a number of at least the most impactful for migration reasons stressors. Yes. Go ahead.
Yeah, I really like the point here, you start with future-oriented decisions are really difficult, and how you can predict in some way the future to help you envision the future and motivate people to do things. So my question is more like a technical thing, right? So the quality of prediction is very important, right, for decision makers. And I'm not sure how much data you have to enable you to like validate or evaluate the uncertainty of prediction, because really dependent, right? If you go back to say, if we had this one, had data up to 2000, right? And if we didn't have data since 2000 until now, can we predict the future, like 20 years later, like 25 years later, what's gonna be? Because that could be the kind of sort of validation to say, I know today, here looks like this, but I had data in the past that were used to predict today. So the same thing is use today's data to predict what's 25 years from now. So can you elaborate a little bit how you validate, or if you were able to?
That is the question. And so the way in which we validate this modeling approach is basically following a hindcast approach. We take past data and we try to recreate the past. First of all, that's what we do. Can we even, with some level of accuracy, recreate the past? And we have demonstrated that we can do that in a fairly accurate way. Now, the overall goal here is not to say, wow, this one parcel was correctly simulated to be developed in March 13 of 2034, but rather our ability of saying, can we accurately represent urbanization and adaptive response processes? Yes. And then that gives us the confidence to say, okay, now let's use this framework that has been validated to project flexible other alternative trajectories, not to really say, hey, this is what's going to happen at this specific point in time, but rather let's evaluate an array of plausible solutions that cost us very little rather than, let's say, implementing those in sample communities to see how it goes, right? The idea here is to use data, model, and analytics to our advantage to test what is possible, evaluate the outcomes, and then balance social and ecological needs.
Yeah, it's a good one, because I don't know how much data you're able to validate, and again, it's not to predict precisely what will happen, because no one can, but as you said, you could build various scenarios to say those things could happen, especially at sort of aggregate level, right? Those things can be, possible, and then the policymakers certainly can say, I'll choose from among those things what's the best way to do it.
You're spot on.
Yeah.
Yes.
So I'm curious, the level of detail for the urban planning predictions. If people are paving vast swaths of the land, that's going to create more runoff and that's going to change the water. Are you trying to predict how the development impacts the flooding as well, or is it not that detailed?
Okay, we have two visionaries so far that have picked on two areas that we are planning to continue developing. We're planning to continue integrating those aspects into the model. So short answer, no, we have not closed that feedback. As cities will continue expanding, that increases impervious surface, minimizes infiltration, and of course, that exacerbates flooding. That is still a pending aspect to continue developing, but of course, we need to do that. So we're connecting the two. And that is future research in our research agenda. Go ahead.
Yeah, I know there's a big planning department at UNC. Are they, are you guys working, does UNC have something that ties into this in any way, or is there any communication or between your group and NC State?
Yes. Oh, sorry, you were gonna ask something else.
Nope. Just
Yes.
and UNC.
Yes, we collaborate with a couple of researchers from the planning department. For example, Dr. Todd Bender, he is a part of the committee for one of my PhD students, and absolutely brings in that planning mindset. For this PhD student, she's looking at how zoning affects urbanization. So he's the perfect component to really help us and challenge us in understanding those processes. But yes, collaboration is really, really, truly important for us, and we make our all efforts possible to bring in local knowledge from the region and even from outside the region.
I had a question.
Sure.
I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about, because you mentioned the importance of community involvement and engagement.
Mhm.
Can you talk about any ways you're engaging with local communities so far, or how you intend to, or how this data might affect, you were saying, like local solutions? So
Right, so for the Charleston case study, we first needed to develop the technology and create this capacity to even simulate these components, urbanization, increased flooding, and adaptive response. The next step will be to continue engaging with communities such as this through participatory modeling, where we engage back and forth iteratively to refine parameters, to refine model aspects, to refine scenarios, and better represent local realities. We are actively searching for funding to do that type of work and that type of engagement, which truly changes the game now. Because then you're not an exercise of, it's not simply an exercise of understanding a number of scenarios, but now let's take that local knowledge to characterize what is truly possible for that one community based on their local knowledge, their preferences, their capacities. So you truly bring in another level of information that we cannot just simply gather from public sources.
Yeah, go ahead.
This one is a serious question.
Oh, I would be open to.
So your resist and reactive approaches are sort of pools of all of the possible ways you could try to stay in place with policy. Similar to like the adaptability score. Is your model sensitive enough to look at specific policy proposals and their impact on either development or migration? Like, say, take wetland reclamation projects. Could your model factor that in to see how it could A, change the flooding, and B, change the populations that are more at risk?
Okay. If we, for example, let me connect that with someone's question. If we're working with a community and they have those either plans or recent changes, let's say they implemented an easement that is supporting wetland reclamation, yes, we can introduce that information, no problem whatsoever. When we simulate at scale and we're working with the Southeast United States, there is just not feasible to introduce that level of information. But if we're partnering with a community, in that information, it will becomes part of the process and becomes part of that local knowledge. So yes.
Thank you.
Okay, go ahead.
The capacity to defend an area presumably implies some sort of economic capacity. Does the model incorporate any economic analysis such that, for example, a low-lying area of low-density, poorly maintained housing might not be worth defending?
That could be assessed through scenarios, but we have not looked into it. It's an interesting idea.
I think economics is one of the factors we're talking about in terms of, whether the resources are in the community.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. Do we have any other questions? Let's still check. Okay, so let's thank the speaker. Thanks very much. Feel free to come up and chat if you have other questions you didn't want to ask in front of the whole room. So.